I came here today to talk about the need for a literate science society. However, after the invitation from Deborah, I looked at what she asked. She said, can you talk about parasites? Maybe you can talk about your life as a minister, as a preacher, or the son of a minister or preacher. And at the time I sat there and I said, well, I should talk more about this literate society thing. However, life is like a box of chocolates. You never really know what you're gonna get. That was Forrest Gump's expression. And I actually live that life is a box of chocolates. You never really know what you're gonna get. Today we're gonna talk about overcoming obstacles, and what I'd like to do is go through a process of my entire life, which has pretty much been a box of chocolates. It starts off like this. When I was 11 years old, I lived in Alabama, decided to go and stay with my uncle for a summer. And there in that summer, and remember I said I'm a preacher's kid, that summer I got a job because I wanted to make some money. I got a job working in a tobacco field. I was so happy. I was 11. They thought I was 14. They never asked. So I went ahead and started working, doing what's called suckering tobacco. My dad found out a few days later that his son was working in a tobacco field and made me quit. Look, you are a minister's son. You do not work in a tobacco field. So that was the end of my income for that summer. I go back to Alabama. We start again. And I'm in school. This high school counselor calls me up. So I'll start off by going back and saying, we weren't that rich. So for religion, I learned to read in the Bible. When I went to school, people were reading Mary Had a Little Lamb. I was reading about the seven-headed beast in Revelations. And all of a sudden, I realized how much more I knew in terms of at least understanding and interpreting things. A high school counselor grabs me one day, asked me what do I want to do for a living. And I said, I'll probably be a janitor or an electrician. Why? My dad was doing janitorial work. He'd gone back to school. He became an electrician. He went back to school. He later became a locksmith. And so for me, it was learning things, but with the idea of being a minister. Life has a funny way of changing things. This high school counselor talks to me about college. And before you know it, she's convinced me that I should do college. I was good at science. She introduced me to a professor at Tuskegee University, who then asked me to be in the summer program. This kid who plans on being a minister now goes and begins to work in science, working in an area he had never heard of. I started working in cytogenetics. And before you know it, I was working on a NASA seeds project, looking at space-exposed tomato plants. I'd figured out just before that how to stain or put a stain on these chromosomes from cancer cells. And so with the NASA project, this guy who was working in a tobacco field, later on began working in a cotton field, was now working in a laboratory. It's funny how things began to switch up, because just before I started working in the laboratory, which I think was one of the best things to change me, I worked in a cotton field. And in that cotton field, I worked first doing drought. Second year they had floods. And I said, I'm done with this hot stuff. And I got a job in a truck stop. Anyone know why I got a job in a truck stop? I'll tell you. Air conditioning. When you're in Alabama and it's 100 degrees, the first thing you want is air conditioning. I worked in the truck stop, and it happened to be a young lady who was there, another kid around my age. She worked at the fire station, or the fireworks station right next door to me. I walked over there and I saw her one day and I said, hey, how are you doing? She says, oh, hi, you work next door? I said, yes. So we started talking. She said, why don't you have lunch with me sometime? I said, oh, that'll be great. I got off work for lunch, went over to visit her, and after going to visit her, we sat there and laughed. I went back to work that day, and my supervisor looked at me and he said, Emmitt, where were you at? I said, I went out to lunch. He said, where'd you go? It's a strange question. I said, I went out. He said, did you go over to the fireworks station? I said, yes. He said, was Heather there? I said, yes. He said, okay, Emmitt, we don't need your services anymore. Have a nice day. You see, I was an African-American guy. Heather was a white girl. I got fired from my first job that was not in the fields. 2 weeks later, I was working at Tuskegee University doing science. 2 years later, I was on Nova doing a TV show for PBS, talking about extracting DNA from tomato plants. Life really is a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So I started work at Tuskegee University, did exceptionally well, ended up going to a place called the University of California, San Francisco, and had a fantastic time working with a marvelous lady who trained me and taught me how to do a different type of intense molecular biology. I graduated and decided where I wanted to go for graduate school, University of California, San Francisco. Now, again, life is again a box of chocolates. I've done so well as an undergraduate, and then I leave there to go to Tuskegee, to go to UCSF. UCSF, going from Alabama to San Francisco, very, very, very different scenario. So when I was at Tuskegee, the cost of a house was $125 for my room, and the whole place was $450. Trying to get in places in San Francisco was a completely different story. In San Francisco, I went there just before I arrived, just before I left, looking for a place, and they had a showing. The showing was for $1,400 for a 2-bedroom place, and there were 50 of us in line, and they had first month's rent, last month's rent, and deposit. I had no money. I left, went home, came back for school, and I was homeless. I realized I didn't have a place to stay. I couldn't afford it. My girlfriend at the time was going to Stanford. She loaned me her car because she was going out for a retreat. I took her car with the idea that I would be sleeping in Golden Gate Park that night. Again, I got a slight curveball. Found out about a professor who had a house. He had moved to Boston, a guy named Greg Petco, who I've never met before. Someone told me that he had a place open that I could actually go in and visit. I could stay at his place for the night as long as I took care of his plants. Let me tell you, I made sure that those plants grew well. They went from brown to green in 2 days. After that, I found a place 3 days later. Probably the cheapest rent in San Francisco and only half a mile from UCSF. I started graduate school, excited, got into a fantastic lab. And when I say life has a way of throwing curveballs, I go into the lab, start the lab, worked on the project, and 4 years in, was scooped completely. You see, I was working on trying to identify the master regulator of mitosis. And I was there. I was excited. I'm thinking eventually I'm going to graduate early from this great place. My advisor was a famous guy, a guy by the name of Ira Hershkowitz, a yeast geneticist. Ira calls me into his office, and Ira says, "Emmitt, I've got some good news and some bad news." I said, "Ira, tell me the good news. Tell me the bad news first. And then I want to hear the good news because I like to feel good after I hear bad news, so I can walk away here happy." And it's better than that movie my daughter had me watch last night, which basically ended up with everyone dying, and I felt terrible going to bed. So Ira says, "Emmitt, I've got something to show you." He shows me a paper. And that paper was everything I had done as a graduate student, plus all the stuff I had not thought of yet. There was nothing I could do to recover from that. So I looked at Ira and said, what does this mean? I mean, my entire thesis project is gone. I have nothing to do here. What do I do? And he said, "Well, you know, they pretty much have everything there." And I said, "Well, now that I know the bad news, tell me the good news." And he looked at me, he said, "At least you know you were right." I said, "I don't want to know I'm right. I want everyone else to know that I'm right." I started over my 4th year of graduate school. And it was at that moment that I became an expert in alternative careers in science. Why? Because I knew academics was not going to be the route that I was going to take to do science. So I got into intellectual property law. I got into the business of science. And before you know it, I had job offers in patent law, job offers in business. So I go back, a few years go by, I'm in my 6th year, and I'm ready to do my thesis talk, or ready to finish up my last committee meeting. I just had an interview, and let me tell you, this is a really interesting thing. It was the time when there were no jobs in California, and I'm looking for a job in patent law. There are no jobs. And everyone told me, look, you're not going to get a job. So you have to think differently. I called up every patent law firm in San Francisco. Just called them by phone, trying to see if I can get somebody. And before you know it, I got a partner. Said, hello, my name is Emmitt R. I'm a graduate student, Ph.D. student at UCSF. I'm really interested in finding out information about intellectual property law. I'd love to be able to talk to you if you got a chance. And I was waiting on a click, click, click. The guy says, give me a little time and I'll give you a call back, which is automatically, I'm not going to talk to you. Give him my number. We set an appointment. He called me back. Less than 2 months later, I'm in an interview sitting for an intellectual property law job as a scientific advisor to a company. And before you know it, the lady says, this is the fastest I've ever seen anyone get a job in this place. Who do you know? Yeah. I go back, I'm so excited about this position, waiting for them to call me to tell me about it. And before you know it, I'm ready to give have my last thesis committee meeting, and a paper comes out that scoops half of what I've already done for my PhD. I go into my thesis committee and I show them this paper, and they say, well, you can't graduate yet because you can't publish what you have. So this is Friday. On Monday, I get a phone call from the company saying, congratulations, you've just got the job pending completion of your PhD. You see, I had to say, well, I might have to go back to school a little bit longer than I thought. And I did. And then I got into business. And I started looking at business sales. And then I went and finished my PhD a little longer. And 7 years later, I got my PhD. It was a journey and completely different from the 4-year PhD that one would have expected. But the challenge here, the real challenge here, is that regardless of what things were thrown, there was this urge to keep moving. You see, life really is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. After my postdoc, I ended up starting a small biotech company. And before you know it, after that, I ended up getting a faculty position here at Case Western. Interestingly, I lived in Cleveland before I moved to Alabama till the age I was 7. And the interesting thing about that is I still had relatives here. I did global health and disease. The first Center for Global Health and Disease was built right here in Case Western Reserve University. All of a sudden, these twists in my life began to shift so that all of these things that were happening were almost falling in place, because life really is this box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. It reminds me of a story my dad told me, and I'm going to end with this. There are 2 parts. One is a 5 and dime story, and I like to tell this story. And my dad, this guy who always told stories, who worked on people's spirituality, would say, there was this little boy named Johnny. And Johnny went to school one day. And these kids asked Johnny which one of these coins had more value, the nickel or the dime. And Johnny would look at them and smile, and he would grab the nickel. The nickel is worth more than the dime. And they would laugh at him and talk about how stupid Johnny was. Oh, Johnny's stupid. Next person comes, Johnny, which one of these is worth more, the nickel or the dime? Johnny would look, they'd grab the nickel, ha, ha, ha. And they would talk about Johnny and how stupid he was to go by saying that the nickel was worth more than the dime. This went on the entire day. And inevitably someone went home and told Johnny's dad about this event that was going on all day, how ignorant his son was to think that the nickel was worth more than the dime. Johnny gets home and his dad looks at him. He says, Johnny, I need to talk to you. Johnny says, okay. Johnny, which one of these is worth more, the nickel or the dime? Johnny looks at his dad, grabs him, the nickel's worth more. His dad looks at Johnny and he goes, you know that a dime is worth more than a nickel. Why would you say that a nickel is worth more than a dime? And Johnny looks up at his father with these big, bright eyes. And then he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out an entire pocket of nickels. And he says, Dad, if I say that the dime is worth more, then the game would be over. You see, we have to think differently. This whole cliche of if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. We have to think differently. One door closes, another one opens. All of these cliches means the same thing. Life is like a box of chocolates, but in the end, it's in your hands. Which brings me to the final story. Another one of those stories my dad used to tell me, which is about an African boy who went to America. He got trained, he left the village, and then he came back to hang out with his friends. And he and his friend decided they're going to play a trick on the old wise man. And here was the trick, here's the idea. Oh wise man, what they would do is walk up to him and ask him with a bird in their hand, a little small bird, and say, is this bird in our hand dead or alive? They'd cover it so he couldn't see. And then if the old wise man said that the bird was alive, they would crush it and show him that it was dead. If he said that it was dead, they just release it and show him that this bird was alive. They'd play a trick on the old wise man. So they go to the old wise man and goes, oh wise man, tell us whether this bird in our hands, tell us whether it is dead or whether it is alive. And the old wise man looked at them, remembering them as they were as kids, and smiled. And he said, it's in your hands. It's in your hands whether that bird is dead or alive. When it comes to challenges, there are some things that we can control and some things that we cannot control. Life has its challenges and complications. It really is a box of chocolates. But how you deal with it in the end is in your hands. Thank you.